Okay, so I'm going to talk about automation. You heard some about the recent product releases around Globus Flows yesterday from Rachana. She gave you just a very brief overview of that service. So I will include that in this presentation, but I actually wanted to spend a little bit of time, because I know there are some in the room that are also new to Globus, to sort of talk about automation as a continuum. So when we think of automating different tasks, perhaps the one that comes to mind immediately is file transfer, because that's still the core service, and most people use Globus primarily for file transfer. So if you just want to automate your transfers, again, Rachana mentioned the timer service. I'll just show you that again in a little bit. But then there's probably, certainly we've come across a lot of use cases where the command line, the Globus CLI is actually more than adequate for automating certain tasks, perhaps simpler tasks, and especially when it comes to automating things that that include, calling out to, batch job schedulers or things like that. So when you already have environments that are sort of script heavy, the CLI is a great way to sort of weave Globus service access into those existing environments. And then sort of at the other end of the continuum is this more robust, comprehensive service called Flows. So we'll talk about that as well, and you'll get to play with it a little bit if you like. And as I go through each of these, I'm going to try and come at them from these three perspectives. So there's the researcher, who is the investigator, PI, what have you, that we're trying to serve collectively, and that's obviously an important constituency, perhaps the most important one, but equally important are the people that are administering the services, many of you in the room. In the case of something like the CLI, perhaps, and certainly with Flows and other parts of the API that Rachana talked about, the developer perspective is just as important. So I will sort of come at it from these three different directions. Okay. So let's first look at the timer service. So this is probably the most basic use case, and we see lots of this, which is I need to sync something between this storage system and that storage system, or I need to do, perhaps a dash delete. So I'm, keeping two things in sync periodically, and I need to do it on a regular schedule. It may be a backup, it may be a whatever, clearing out, scratch stuff and putting it aside in case it's needed. Who knows? So this is core use case for the timer service, and the timer service is pretty much, it can do everything that you can do via the web app, or almost everything you can do via the web app and the API. It is accessible via the web app, as Rachana showed you, the sort of the uptick in growth since we made that available via the web app. But prior to that, we had the CLI, and that again has been used quite a bit by the early adopters, certainly. And NIH was one of those early adopters. NIH is a very large Globus user. I think they have upwards of 2,000 guest collections at some point, maybe even more. So extensive usage. And so they automate a number of tasks to their Firewolf cluster and the Helix group. And that's what a timer job setup may look like on the CLI. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it should be fairly self-explanatory. You're transferring, you're giving it a name so you can track it, because this will look just like another transfer task. So you'll be able to monitor it through the management console and do all the same sorts of things as you can do with a transfer that's submitted via the web app, API, what have you. So this is how often it's going to run. This is when it starts. And then here's the source destination endpoints and paths. So pretty straightforward. And Rachana did show you in the web app. So let me pull that up. She just showed you a screenshot, but I'll go in here for those that haven't seen it. Make sure this is that big enough? That legible in the back? Huh? One bigger? There? At least? Okay. Then I have to sit back. Okay. So these, the file options were here before timer, obviously, so you can set these for a recurring transfer, like a timer job. But this is, below the line of the timer option, so I can have something that starts, tomorrow at whatever time and repeats, let's say daily, every day, and never ends. Okay, so most of you know cron. It's Globus cron. That's pretty much sums it up. So if I set that transfer task, then I can actually see it when I go to my console. I think I should have one here. I have had network issues today, so hopefully they will not persist, which they are. Okay. Okay. When all else fails, tether. So I'm not. I think it must be the network. Someone can confirm that the service is running properly. Let's try that. Okay, that's a little. Well, maybe just because it went funky. Okay, I am not sure what is going on here. Okay. Yeah, so let's try going to activities and see our, let's see our timer jobs here. I'm not sure why this is loading so slowly. Can someone, it's working fine there? Okay, so okay. I have to be careful that I don't show you my students' grades here accidentally. Okay. Let's try that. You were right, Lee. And that's nowhere near the maximum number of tabs I have open normally. So, okay. So let's look at one of these timers that I have set up here. So actually, Ken Miller talked about this data mobility exhibition yesterday. And we do have, as I said, a few endpoints around. So periodically, some of them get cleaned up because we live by the graces of the administrators there, but they do clean up things. And so I do every few days have the sync job, for instance, that takes our 8-ish odd terabytes of data and puts it, moves it and replicates it basically from Eagle at Argonne to NCAR. And if I go and look at my tasks, I can see that some of those were. Let me see where the last one was. Yeah, so here's a timer. Here's a timer run, so you can see 8 terabytes transferred at whatever that is, 12-ish gigabits per second, which is actually pretty slow. We normally have a very nice fast path between these two endpoints. So so that's really a transfer, pretty straightforward. I mean, timer, straightforward for automating transfers. But let's talk about more interesting things, which is the Globus command line. Just by show of hands, how many people in the room use the Globus command line today? Okay. I'll take that an opportunity to point out why you may want to look at it, although that may just be a testament to the fact that the web app is terrific and covers all your needs, which is also good, or the API. So the CLI is just a set of Python tools, basically, nicely packaged, uses the same auth model, talks to the same API as the web app, and I'll show you, how we access it. But in order to use it for automation, there are three things that I want to highlight as being common pretty much across the board. So the first is sort of how do you do evergreen auth, as I call it. And Rachana talked about native app grants. So if you're going to use the CLI, it's a native app, right? It's a set of scripts. You're going to probably plug it into other scripts. So it means the app can't keep a secret. So when you register your script, your automation script, command line script with Globus Auth, you do that as a native app. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. The other thing is you typically don't want to have a user having to authenticate and do things in the middle of automated scripts. So using guest collections is always great. That was also stressed, and Lee made the point as well in the previous question. And then the other thing is to delegate management of permissions to the application. So I always like to say apps are people too. So you can let apps do things on your behalf by granting them, in this case, access manager roles on said guest collection. And that way it would be just the same as you as an administrator pointing and clicking and adding permissions or revoking permissions or what have you. So we'll look at that. I think I just said all of that. Yeah, and the important thing is when you register a native app with Globus Auth, there's actually a special callback URL. So it's unlike your app where you would register your own URL as a callback. There's a standard callback URL. And the flow, I think Rachana walked through that. It's just sort of a variation on the standard authorization code grant flow in OAuth 2. If you want to look at some examples, a very simple example of how this can be done, and really this focuses on getting tokens, doing a very simple copy, and then storing the tokens. And obviously, because you can't keep a secret, you're going to be getting tokens as well as an access token as well as a refresh token. Those things you obviously need to keep somewhere securely, so you store them somewhere in the file system, maybe database, and make sure that's secure and not accessible to anyone other than the script. And that's about it, really. So if you're going to use the CLI, you have to be comfortable with UUIDs because there are UUIDs everywhere. So let me actually switch over to, I'll put this on the side here so I can copy paste, and then we'll run a few of these things so you can see what it looks like. So if you'd like to follow along, you can actually go to the instances that are out there have the Globus CLI installed. Let me see, is that's probably not big enough. Is that good-ish? Okay, so I'm gonna shell into my instance. I'm number 11, so dev 11 at tut11.globusdemo.org. Password is globus _ 2022 pound. And you can simply run, so I have it set up so it's in the path, so you can just run Globus and you will see that same help screen that I showed you on the slide. So a whole host of commands, many of them aimed at the transfer service, but increasingly pointing at other services like search, for example. So this was added in one of the recent major releases. So you can run some of these things so you can get a a feel for the output, and I'll call out a couple of things. So searching for, okay, so the first thing I need to do is authenticate, because like I said, this uses the same model. So I have to authenticate, and this does the native app flow. So in this case, because I don't have a browser on this instance, headless nodes, I'm going to go here and go through the authorization code grant. Okay, thank you. So you've seen this a few times already, consent. So I'm granting consent for that instance of the CLI to access things on my behalf. Put code in there. Okay, and now I can do my search and look for everything that has tutorial and endpoint 1, and there's lots of things, including the actual Globus tutorial endpoint 1 listed at the top here. So that's the one I'm actually going to use. So what I will do is actually copy that, and I'll just stick it in, let's just call it, how about source? Okay, so we'll just keep that as a source endpoint, and we'll run a few commands against that. A lot of times you have to deal with getting identities in your script, and again, you typically want to get UUIDs, although some commands will operate on the actual identity in the sort of identity at the IDP form. But the get identities command actually gives you, it sort of goes both ways. So if you give it that as input, it will return the UUID for that identity in Globus auth, and vice versa if you give it a UUID. So that is my identity, and that UUID belongs to our good friend Steve, who lives on in the ether. So that's all good. So I'm going to walk through a two-step process of automating something, and that's going to be a simple thing of moving some data and then granting access to that data to a user or a group. And I'm going to do the same thing with the Globus Flows service. So I think it's nice to sort of compare and contrast how you might do that. If all you wanted to do was that, and you just had an occasional need, and maybe you've got some other infrastructure that's already wired up and you want to add it, this is all you would have to do. So we've gotten our source ID. So let me just find my Eagle tutorial, because that's the other one. I'll use these two as I'll use this as the destination. So export dest. Okay, so we've got two. So now I can do, and let me actually show you this in the in here as well. So let me put source here, tutorial endpoint 1, and Eagle on this side. So we're going to go between these two endpoints. So I have some pictures here in this carousel directory, and we will move them to, I think Globus was the blank one that I created. Yep. So we'll go from here, this path on this endpoint, to Globus World. Okay, so I think that's what I have here. So really straightforward. This is a simple task. You can, I gave it the recursive option, so it's going to copy everything that directory recursively. You can also do batch transfers, where you can give the Globus transfer command a file that contains a list of files to move, essentially. So if you've got stuff, even though it still needs to be between a source and a destination endpoint, but if you wanted to move this stuff here and this and that, you don't have to launch separate transfer tasks. You just launch one, and you give it this dash batch option, and it'll move all of that over. So so I can, I get a task ID back. So this would be, if I go look at this in the web app, I'll see, okay, it's already completed. So that's the task. But I could also, and probably would want to, if I'm automating this through through the CLI. I would want to, maybe get the status of that task. So, and I could look at the status field and make sure that, it's succeeded before I do the next thing, which is grant the user some permissions. Okay, so that would be that step. So then the next thing is, as I say here, to set the permissions. So I did mention this point here, which is that the app requires the access manager role. And actually, let me show you that before I run more commands. So if you were to do this, you would go first to developers.globus.org and register your apps. In this case, your app is a script. And I'll go down here, make that a little bigger. Okay, so we're going to add a new app. And we'll call it Globus World 22 tutorial. And this is the important box here. So it's going to be used by a native app. And this is the sort of special redirect URL that's provided for you automatically. And so now we have this this registered app, this client to Globus, and this is the client ID. So if we wanted this app to act again like a person, we would grant this application access manager permission. So let's go to our to that destination where we put the data. So that was on Eagle. Where is that? Here we go. And this is where we do that. So under roles, you can see here we've got a few of us that have access to this collection in admin or access manager role. But I'm going to do the same thing here. So I'm going to, instead of giving it a vas@globus.org, I'm going to give it a client ID at clients.auth.globus.org. Okay, and I'm going to add access manager role. Okay, so that's user GW22 tutorial. So it's a user, but it's our app. Okay, so add the role. Oh, okay. I must log in. So I'm logged in as someone else. This is my linked identity, so I just have to verify that I still have access to that. So I guess it would be nice if I knew that beforehand. Okay. Access manager, add role. Okay, so our app now can act just like a human administrator and manage permissions on that guest collection. So we've moved the data over. So the next step is to grant permission. So actually, I don't need that export, so I can just do this. So we moved it to, it was dest, right? So dest Globus World. Actually, let's just make sure our files are there first. Yep, so that's the data we just moved over. And in this case, I'm granting read permissions to this identity, demo.globusID.org. You could just as easily grant access to a Globus group. In fact, that's usually the more sort of practical and useful thing to do. It's very common, like in a data distribution use case where, maybe there's a lab that's using a sequencer or a cryo EM or something, and you want to make their data available. So you pull it off the microscope or the instrument, copy it somewhere where you can set permissions, and then grant permissions to that PI's lab or group. So you have a Globus group for that lab, and every other lab perhaps, or department, or however you structure it. And then just by virtue of adding or removing members to that group, they will get access to the data. So I'll just run that, and creates an access rule. And guess what? Access rules are first-class citizens too, so they have a rule ID. So I can go and look at that. If I go back to that collection, which I move off of, we will see that permission has been added. So again, this is all stuff that you could do by pointing and clicking, but obviously to do it at some level of scale, you would want to do it automatically. So here's the permission we just added. We granted this user or this identity read access to this path on that guest collection. So they would only be able to access that and nothing else. Yeah.
So you created the ID for that role.
Yes.
But you didn't make use of it when you
Very observant, Todd. Yes. So I didn't write the script and run it as that script. So I'm showing you the steps. So I'm running them as me. But if this was a script running without me behind the keyboard, it would be running as this client, and it would have gone through the initial authentication, saved the tokens, and be able to just perpetually do that. Yeah. Well spotted. Lev was dying to call out me out on that one, I know. Yeah.
I have the same question.
Yeah.
You made the app.
Yes, I made the app to show you what you would do if you wanted. So the question for those remotely is, I created this app, but I didn't really do anything with it other than make it an access manager. And that's because just to keep things simple, I'm showing you the commands that you would run. I'm running those commands as me using my own identity as a human identity. But if you were running those commands in an automated fashion via a script, that script would actually be this client with this client ID running those commands. So this Globus auth identity would be the one calling on auth to get access tokens and refresh tokens, running the commands, and setting permissions and doing all the other things. It could be either. Yeah. Yeah.
Somewhere in there, you embed this UI.
When you authenticate, basically you authenticate, yeah, as this client. Yeah. Yeah, and we have in that, if you want to look at how this is done in a very simple fashion, if you go to that, these slides will all be posted, but that one slide that I just showed, I don't know where it is. Yeah, the native app examples, you see exactly this. Okay, so that's all. So pretty straightforward. And actually, let me just delete this. So you can also revoke permissions, right? So obviously, you don't want these things living forever, perhaps. So same way that I granted the permission, I can revoke it using delete, and I just need to give it the UUID for that specific. Okay, I guess I need the endpoint and then the rule ID. So it's on the desk endpoint. So now I've revoked permissions, and you'll have to trust me. I don't want to go back to the way I have to show you, but they're now gone. And a couple other things you can do here. So some of these commands return a lot of stuff. So like if I, and it's usually easy, at least for me, it's easier for me to work with JSON. But so all these commands have the option to return the results in JSON formatted. So if I go look at all my endpoints in JSON, that's a lot of stuff, and perhaps I only care about things like the ID or the display name. So we actually do have an option to use JamesPath to parse that command. So if you just give it the --JamesPath and then a JamesPath query. So in this case, I'm pulling the data, which was this list that came back, right? So this is this whole list, and then I'm extracting from that ID and display name for every endpoint. So that will return something a little more sane, and I could parse that or loop through it and do whatever I need to do in my script as appropriate. So just be aware of that. So again, this is a very sort of high level flyover on the CLI. I just felt like I would be remiss if I didn't spend at least some time on it, because I find it an incredibly powerful tool for doing a lot of cool things. Any questions on the CLI? No. Okay. All right. How are we doing for time? Plenty of time. So the cool stuff, the automation ecosystem. So Rachana talked about flows. So we're going to cover three things: defining and deploying flows. And that's actually going to be the last thing, which I'm just going to talk to. We're not actually going to do that, but that's for extending the services that flows can have access to through action providers. So we're going to focus on running some flows. In fact, I'm going to do it sort of counterclockwise, starting up there at the 2 o'clock mark. So we're going to run some flows. So we're going to come at it first from the researcher perspective, running flows. Then we'll see what it takes to define and deploy flows. And then we'll close it out by talking about action providers. So I'll show again a couple of the slides from Rachana's talk, just so we have a refresher. So flows is the service that allows you to run these automated sets of tasks in a robust, reliable way with the same fine-grained security that underpins every other service on the Globus platform. So flows comprise actions. You can see sort of the stylized example here. If you like to look at it vertically, it's over there. And you can see some, or in fact, most of these actions in the flow use an action provider tied to another Globus service. So this talks to the auth, Globus auth service to get credentials. Second step talks to the transfer service to move data, et cetera, et cetera. Kyle and Ben talked about FuncX yesterday and so on. Yeah, so actions they use action providers to take an action on some other service. And then in future, we will get to a point where we have other means for triggering these flows. Rachana mentioned timers as a way to kick off a flow. So on some regular schedule, do some set of actions. But we want to sort of generalize that to be able to key off things like file system events and what have you. And we actually have versions of this out there, but it's nowhere near ready for production. But certainly in some of the work we've done with some of the large light sources and that, we've automated the entire spectrum of activities, right from when the data comes off a beamline to the point where it's actually put into an index with metadata and everything. And so there are some triggers out there already. So what is behind flows? We actually didn't build this amazing infrastructure all from scratch. We heavily leveraged AWS Step Functions. If you're not familiar with Step Functions, it's basically a managed state machine service. So you define the state machine as a DAG, and it runs. It runs reliably, it runs at scale. So all the attributes that we look to Amazon to provide for us in other services apply here as well. And an important point is kind of buried here, but you can have a human in the loop here, which is important for many flows. So we have, for example, some flows like the ones I just mentioned from the advanced photon source, where some data is pulled off the instrument. There's some pre-processing or there's some analysis that's done, but then someone looks, in that flow, there's a step that says, human, look here, sort of review what's coming off the beamline. Perhaps they need to, move the sample, refocus, whatever, and then say, yep, that looks good. Now let's run the thing, for the next, 1,000 or 10,000 images or what have you. So you can do all of that. And as I said, yeah, the Globus auth model underpins all of this as well. So actually, instead of me showing you slides here, so let's actually dive into this. And I encourage you, if you are logged in, you can poke at some of this yourselves. I'm not going to access anything that you don't have access to. So in the web app, you'll see flows down here next to the console. I was asked yesterday, I think, or the day before, yesterday, I guess, where can I access it? I'm like, ooh, maybe we need to make this flows thing a little more prominent. So I think Teresa's working on flashing, color morphing. No, just kidding. So this is where you access flows. Can't see too much on here. So we have a number of pre-built sort of canned flows that you can use, that the Globus has defined, deployed, and made available to folks to run. But this is, again, looking at it from the perspective of a researcher or administrator. So this presumes that someone, it may have been that same person, but in many cases it may not be. It may be one of us as an administrator that's defined this flow, deployed it, and said, hey, Lee, you and your group have been granted access to run this flow whenever you're working with this instrument or whenever you're dealing with this analysis or what have you. So I'm going to find one here. Am I looking for two-stage, right? Is that the right one? Yeah, so this is one of the flows that's been defined. Thank you, Kurt. So what we've tried to do is sort of hide a lot of the, I wouldn't call it complexity, but there's a lot of craft behind here that users don't need to be aware of. There's a lot of stuff that does the magic, and literally just give them a big button to say go and run the flow. And one of the gargantuan efforts the last few months by the web app and others, web app team, was to provide a UI like this that looks at the flow definition and then renders a UI that allows you to provide the various inputs for this flow. So this flow is actually a two-stage or two-hop flow. Many of you might have this in place, sort of be doing it manually, where you're taking data from some system that doesn't necessarily, that you don't want to have exposed on your Science DMZ, perhaps. You're moving it to an intermediate point, and then you're taking it from there to the destination. So that's what this flow is going to do. It's going to move data from a source endpoint to an intermediate endpoint, and then to its final destination. So it's going to complete 2 transfers and a delete step, because it's a move. So it's copy from here to here, here, and then delete. And you can label each of those steps optionally. You can add tags to identify this run, and then you can, you probably should give it a label so that you can identify it when you're when you want to manage it or look at it for progress. So so let's actually do that. Let's do the exact same thing, which was moving that data from the tutorial endpoint to Eagle. So I'm going to look for Globus tutorial endpoint 1. So it allows me to browse that. So this was the folder that we moved. So I'm going to say select that. And let's get to Eagle by way of Globus tutorial endpoint 2. Okay, so kind of hokey, but hopefully you're getting the point of this. So we're just gonna, drop it in there temporarily, because again, that's a transient point, so it's gonna get cleaned up afterwards. And then we want to go to Eagle tutorials, and we'll just put it in that same Globus World folder. Okay, so 1, 2 transfers, and then a delete step. And we're going to tag this with Globus World 22 tutorial, and that's probably good enough. And VAS demo flow Globus 22 tutorial. Oops. Okay, so that's it. A few clicks and I can start the flow. So this is akin to, transmitting or submitting a transfer request to Globus, right? It's here, go do this. And I can walk away and it will run and do its thing. Was their hand up? Yeah, can just grab the mic if you wouldn't mind, please. There.
Thank you. Can it be made into a URL that I would put on a desktop on a laptop goes in the field, and on the desktop of that laptop there is a shortcut, which is click with pre-populated source and destination and middle, and I just wanted to transfer from the field to my institutional storage and to tape archive as well. So three hops.
Yeah, so I don't know if we can turn it into a URL that does the go. You probably could, but certainly everything that I've done here is just talking to the API. And yes, you could pre-can all the parameters, and you could have a button that says submit this flow with the appropriate credentials, whatever, and it would literally just go to the flow service and do a flow run. Okay, and if you had that in some URL with some little simple app wrapper on it, you probably could do it. Yeah, we don't necessarily give you the URL here that says, here's a shortcut to run this. Maybe we have some things, cool like that in the works, but I'm looking over at Bridget.
Copy link to transfers.
Yeah.
You can do. And hard code.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that'll work too.
Yeah.
Oh, sure. So these flows, VAS, is showing you, we tried to make them as general as possible so that everyone could use them for their own collections and their own transfers. But the idea is that you could take those as examples, deploy your own flow, modify the ones that we have here to, for example, hard code your own collections, even your own directories. If you have particular paths, your users are going to transfer to and from, for example. And so you can deploy those. And then each of these flows, you can define them by a URL right to the start page. And then they can either just click start, or if there's additional parameters that you need them to input, they could input those then.
Thank you. Any other questions on that? So while we were talking there, that flow ran. It obviously wasn't anything too extensive, but we could have watched it run. So it moved the data, and we can actually check that it's there. It should, oops. If I go back to my Eagle collection, I should be a new few. So we've dumped that whole folder into there. That's really all that happened. If we wanted to look at sort of the blow by blow of what happened, this is where I guess, yeah, it's lots of JSON-y stuff. Okay, you can sort of go through this and parse it out, but you can see some, hints, right? That was the Globus tutorial endpoint 1, etc. So this is a very verbose log by design, but mostly you're not going to be sort of looking at this as a human. You might be automating some things to extract progress or what have you, some other details. But I do want to point out the roles, for instance, here. So everyone, I think everyone, right? Bridget has access to run this flow. If you, yeah. Yes. Yes, so these flows are intended, thank you for that. So yes, I had that, but I forgot it. These flows are intended to be used by subscribers because at least one of the endpoints in the flow must be a managed endpoint. You have the option to define some flows, simple flows, as a non-subscriber and deploy them, but there are some limits which you can look up. I think there are some time limits as far as how many times you can run it and how often how long it lives. But the point I wanted to make on this page is that this is just like another resource, any other resource on the Globus platform, in that you can grant access to this resource. So you can grant manager access, or you can grant the ability for someone to run this, and so on, just like any other, just like you do on collections and so on. And I'll go, actually, let's go back to the run list, because some of the other cool stuff that was added was all this advanced filtering. So if you imagine, these things, I just showed you one run, but if we are running this at scale, and like we've done some runs, for instance, at the APS, where there were many thousands of flows run within a very short time window, a few hours perhaps. So, you may want to look at, out of those 10,000, which ones failed. So you can do some quick shortcut filtering. In fact, these are actually some of the APS ones that I was referring to. Or I could do something even a little more advanced and say, show me all the ones that I ran that failed. And I guess, yeah, so then I'll just see mine. So this is a sort of selective, progressive refinement, I guess, of the filters. Okay. Anything else I should point out, Bridget? Okay. No. All right. So so I'm going to go back to the library, and now we're going to start looking at this. So that was a little bit of the admin view. So you could, as an administrator, have access to sort of monitor, if you will, these flows, or look at their progress and look at what users have actually done, how often they've been run, things like that. And then the third, so the next step down is to actually define these flows. So let's look at what a flow looks like. I'm going to click on the flow and click on this definition tab. And I'm going to flash this really quickly because it's going to be a little scary, because it's just a bunch of JSON, but it's actually very readable JSON. It's, the next step. And, if you go down to the bottom of this flow, oops, it tells you start at this step, get source collection, and then do the next thing, and then do the next thing, and so on. And a lot of this is, comments and additional, it's a lot of default options. So basically that's the definition. And then you also have, sorry, I should have shown you this. And then this flow, you saw that that web page that had the fields. Those are derived by looking at this input schema. So for instance, you saw a source endpoint field. So that is of type Globus collection. So that will tell the form to basically give you a field that allows you to browse a Globus, the list of Globus collections, and so on. Okay. So, and it has to be, source UUID. So there's enforcement of, the sort of type value checking here in certain cases, to make sure, or to minimize the chance that you're giving the flow bad data. Okay. Now, you may be wondering, boy, do I have to write all that stuff on my own? The answer is no, but maybe. So I'm going to switch over to our Jupyter Hub again. So Rachana showed you this earlier. So jupyter.demo.globus.org is where I'm going. And I'm going to run another notebook as soon as this loads up. And you can run this notebook too. There's nothing in the flow that's in there is actually one that everybody can deploy and run. So you should be able to step right through that notebook. Make it a little bigger. So this is the notebook I'm going to walk through, automation using Globus Flows. So open that up. And we're going to do the exact same thing here. that I did using the command line interface. It's a simple two-step flow. I'm going to submit a Globus transfer to move some data. And then on that destination endpoint, I'm going to grant permissions that allows a group in this case to access the data. Previously, I gave access to just that one Globus user. In this case, it's going to be to a group. So this is all set up here, but you can see we have Globus tutorial endpoint 1 and the same Globus tutorials endpoint on Eagle. Again, we're using the UUIDs. And then this group called tutorial users is who I'm going to grant access to. These are my collaborators, let's say, to that data that I'm moving. And actually, if you go, you can join this group, tutorial users. It's, as the name suggests, it's for you to join, and you'll be able to actually access the data when I put it there. So I'm going to run through a couple of these steps, and then I'm going to stop and walk through some of the details when we get to the flow definition. So that's just plain setup. We'll run it, Shift Enter. Rachana talked about getting tokens from Globus Auth. Here's another example. Same stuff, no magic. In this case, we're actually pulling the tokens from the Jupyter Hub environment. So we've integrated Globus Auth into Jupyter Hub. So you don't actually have to go and do the authorization code flow to get a token. You simply pull them out of a pickled object in the environment. And actually here I'm printing them just so you can see what comes back. So we have a ton of tokens here because I actually happen to be asking for multiple scopes. So I actually got, a transfer token, a search token, and that's because we put all those in the environment because the different notebooks use different tokens. But here are the flows credentials, and here you can see the different scopes. Okay, so there's a view flows scope, there's a run. Oops, shouldn't click on these, manage flows, etc. So I've given this notebook access to a few of these things. And so we'll move down here and we will define the flow. So here is the two-step flow. And I'm sorry, this is a little hard to fit on the screen, but should give you an idea. So 2 steps or states, because it's a state machine. The first step is move files. And the second step is set permission. We start at move files, and as it says here, we're moving some data from Globus tutorial endpoint 1. So we need to specify a couple of things. One is, what's the type? So this is an action. There can be other steps like a wait, where the flow has to wait for something to happen. But in this case, we're going to invoke an action. And that action is going to be against this action provider. So here's the action URL. It's actually going to talk to the transfer action provider, and the action it's going to take is a transfer request. That's the action it's going to request. And we have to give it the corresponding scope for that action provider. So I use the word scope a lot, and it's important to recognize that it's used in multiple different contexts. So we have scopes that give us the ability to talk to the actual flow service. Then for each resource in that service, including the action providers, we have separate scopes that allow us to call those and use those action providers. And then we also have scopes that presumably give us access to the various endpoints and so on. So the other thing we have to provide here is a source and a destination. So this is how what the definition looks like. So this flow is going to expect a thing called source endpoint ID and destination endpoint ID. And so this is the magic string for saying that's an input and that's another input. And then we also need corresponding source and destination paths. In this case, we're going to do a recursive transfer. And so once we're done with that, the next step is to set permission. So that's what next defines here. And then here we have we're using the same action provider for a different action. So it's still the transfer service, but now we're calling the set permission action. Okay. And that has its corresponding scope for setting permissions. And we're going to set permissions on that destination endpoint ID and the path where the data gets copied to. And then the rest of the stuff is, again, pretty analogous to what we provided in the CLI command, the permissions. So it's read-only permissions. In this case, we are granting access to a group and not a user. So the principal in the auth entity type, if you will, is actually a group. And so we're going to have to give it a group ID. And then, yeah, once we're done with that, there is no next step. That's the end of the flow. So we're going to just save that. So this is basically just a Python dictionary in this case, right? Called flow definition. So we've defined it. And then we have to define the input schema. So for each of those input parameters to the flow, source, destination, endpoints, paths, and then also the permissions, the group, etc. We have to define what those inputs look like. So here's the inputs for the first step, and then the principal and the principal type for the second step. So these are all strings, and they are of type UUID. So we're enforcing that. And then here's the principal. Again, it's just it's a UUID in this case of a Globus group. And that's it. So let's just run that. So we've got the flow schema. So now we have these two things, and then we just have to give it a name. So I'm just going to change the name here so it's easy to identify. Globus 22 VAS. So if you're following along here, you can change this, do your own thing. I'm going to get rid of the UUID. That should be good enough. Yeah, so this is, we're using the Globus SDK that Rachana mentioned. So this has, instead of using a transfer client to talk to the transfer service, we have a flows client to talk to the flows service. And we're calling that with the deploy flow action. And we're passing it the flow definition and the input schema, and then this title we just created. And then what we're going to get back is a response that's going to include, among other things, an ID, etc. And we've got here in the notebook, just by way of showing you how some of these roles and permissions work. By default, when I deploy this, I'm the only person that can see it. But let's say I wanted to make this more broadly available, or give visibility, or let someone else see it. I could provide the identity ID of the person or the app that needs to have access to this, and it could be added to the flow definition using the update flow command. But for right now, I'm just going to do the deployment, and we'll get back a flow ID. That's what just got deployed. And oh, by the way, there is another scope, because for this instance, this resource of a flow in the flow service, there is a unique scope that has to be, you have to get permissions to access this flow. So now we will actually run this. So what I'm actually doing here is just getting some details about my identity from the flows, from the auth service. So this is that's my primary identity that I'm logged in as. And it's just telling me who's going to get notified when this flow completes. That's just kind of incidental here. But here's where we actually set up the inputs for running the flow. So we're going to set the destination path. Sorry, we're going to set the source endpoint ID and destination path, and this corresponding destination endpoint and path. And then again, we're going to share with that tutorial users group, and we're telling the flow that the principal type is of type group. If we wanted to share with an individual user, the principal type would be identity, and then we would give it another UUID, which just happened to be an individual user or app or something like that. So just going to run that, set those variables, and now we have to authorize it. So again, we generated that new flow, that new scope specific to this flow. So we need to get an access token that's scoped to that flow so we can actually use that token to run the flow. Okay. So now you can see why in the UI we've got, you know, a lot of the stuff is already kind of done for you and kind of pointy clicky. So test Globus Flow 22. So I'm just consenting to have the flow do that and put my authorization code in there. And we are all good. So now we have a token to run that, and we're going to run the flow. So this is the important step. Finally, here we are. Again, we're using the flows client, and we're going to run flow. We're giving it the flow ID. That was the thing that came back when we registered the flow. The scope, that also came back to us, and then the inputs we just defined. And then we're going to give it a label. So I'm just going to call this, let's just change it so I can easily see it. Yes. Okay. I might just leave it like that. And here is where I can specify tags. So this may be your first flow. It's not mine, but I will add, just make it GW22. So that way I've got, I can go back and look for all the GW22 stuff in the console. Okay, so that's really all that's happening here. So I'm gonna run it, and then what this is gonna do is it's actually gonna get the flow status every 5 seconds. So there's just a loop here that says while this flow is active. So there's various states as far as active, you know, succeeded, failed, what have you. So while it's active, it's going to keep sort of checking on it. But in this case, you know, it was straightforward, so it ran pretty quickly. And then here is all the output. So this is the same output that you would see or that I showed you in the event log. But now we can go and look at what was put on into that endpoint. So this is what was copied. We copied a bunch of files into this path. Okay, and this generated a unique path for us here just because we run this tutorial lots of times. So if you're running it, you'll have your own random path in there, but it just copied those 3 files from tutorial endpoint 1. And so that's what's there. And then there's an access rule on that endpoint. So let's actually go look at that permissions were actually granted to us on this endpoint. So let's go back to my Eagle endpoint and look at permissions. And we will see that, where's that path now? I've got to find it. Right, so this is the path here, and you can see we granted a read access to the tutorial users group on this path as part of that flow. That was just done a couple of minutes ago. So everything that I did before in the CLI with lots of typing, it was done here with lots of shift enters, but obviously once it's deployed, you can just run it by clicking the start button. And as we were saying to the earlier question, you could actually, if this was something where the source and destination were, you know, fixed pretty much, maybe just the path was changing or just the file names were changing, you could just have all that sort of wired into the flow so that there really isn't much for the user to do other than press the start button. And so again, I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. So I'm going to sort of clean up my tutorial mess by removing that endpoint. And sorry, not the endpoint. I'm removing the access permission just to keep things a little tidy. And that's it. Oh, and I deleted the data as well. So it's a nice little tidy notebook walking through that whole flow. Now, before I sort of open it up to for questions on this, again, if you're sort of, it feels a little daunting to look at this much, JSON cruft for such a simple thing. Know that, again, these are things that you do once. You define this once, so you obviously put it in place when, test it, make sure it's working. And then it just gets run and no one sort of looks at this. And we also do have some tooling that helps you define and do these things programmatically. It's out there. It's a tool set called Gladiator. It's been used extensively by us, and you're welcome to look at it. We'd love your input on that, but it's mostly sort of a tool we've used on our engagements with, again, like APS and some other light sources. But there are ways to automate this beyond sort of writing things from scratch. But we have tons and tons of examples, so you shouldn't really have to do anything sort of totally net new. Okay, so I've been talking for a long time and throwing a lot of stuff at you. If you're still awake, wave. 2 of you, 3. Okay. I'll take what I can get. Questions? I know the wheels are spinning. Theron, there's one behind you. With all the exciting things you're going to do with flows when you get back.
Yeah. Okay. So for developmentally challenged of us, like Jupyter Hubs and JSON make me very scared. But I want, what's the easiest way for me to take something from the library and tweak and modify and present to my users? Can I just go to one of the library flows and basically copy paste from the definition and make my own?
Yes. And somewhere on the roadmap, I won't say when because I don't know, we will have the option to sort of clone one of these flows, I believe. Right, Bridget? Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And also, this is early on. We're looking for adopters. We want to work with you. Help if you guys or not.
Visual C++ for flows, right? You have a diagram and I want to put pieces.
You're going to bring back my Twitch from 30 years ago. There was another, Charlie. Yeah.
So my mind is seeing that you're satisfying a request I had years ago. And I think Lev brought it up yesterday, of being able to get a data flow to happen that in the middle, a function happens that many small files are selected that move to a function that tars these guys up and then sends them on to a destination.
Yes. And there is.
And what I'd like to see is the library. I'd like to be able to produce a template that I could hand out to our users and not this massive library that you have there already for them to dive through, but that they can pick this and have it call archive home directory and they just select it and off they go.
Yeah, no, that's great. And in fact, we do have a flow. I don't know if it's where it is, but probably look it up.
I couldn't find it.
It has a tar step in it.
I couldn't find it. I looked.
Yeah, so maybe, well, it may not be visible to you. So this is, again, so I think we might have deployed it for some other projects, but we do have one that does a tar and then move. Yeah, so absolutely you can do that. And then as you said, have it wired to these 2 endpoints and it always just goes through that pipe basically. Yeah. Yeah. Was there another question in the back? I thought I saw a hand up, maybe not.
There was a question online and it was just, already answered it, but maybe you can say it again. Will you share the automation notebook, which I assume is the Jupyter?
Yeah, the notebook is there. It's available. You could literally go look at it right now. All you have to do is, log into the Jupyter Hub and you'll see the same notebooks I'm seeing, and you can run that notebook just like I did. You don't need any special permission for that. In fact, what you could do, to Charlie's point, if you wanted to get adventures, you could probably go and take one of the flow definitions from the web app, copy paste that into the notebook, and deploy your own version of that. And you're 3/4 of the way towards something that you can actually use for your own purposes in production. Yeah. Carl has a question.
So you're mentioning this secrets tar workflow is interesting, and that makes me think, I'm assuming that it's not Globus, the service, doing the actual tar. So presumably to implement that, we need to implement like an action provider on our end to actually do the tar. And then the next step would be Globus taking that tar file and transferring it.
Yes, except you don't necessarily need to implement the action provider, because we've done that. I think we use, do we use OAuth SSH to call out to something? Okay, I'd have to get back to you, but yes, you're exactly right. As far as the general design pattern is, you have an action provider that's going to call out to some resource to do that thing, which in this case is run the tar command.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Sorry? Yes, FuncX as an action provider. So you could actually register a FuncX function that does anything you like. Globus services all the way down. Better than turtles. Okay. Any other questions? Still have some time. I'm going to talk briefly about action providers, but yeah, was there another hand in the back? No. Okay. Yeah. Never mind. Okay. So let me see what I have left here. We saw all that. We saw that. Yeah. So this is the last thing I think I have here. I think this is still mostly the list of action providers. So the blue ones are the ones we have developed against mostly our services. Of note, things like user form. So you can create that human in the loop perhaps to confirm or provide some input on something. But the common ones, transfer, set ACLs, just ingest into search. That's a very important one. If you're automating, describing data and then pulling it into some kind of index in automated fashion. But then there's the FuncX one that Bridget, that Rachana mentioned, as well as some other slightly more customized ones. This extract is one that was done to automatically extract metadata from some sets of files. But if you wanted to write one of these, there is actually an action provider as the toolkit. What you're essentially doing is implementing an API that has these endpoints on it that flows a flows action can call to run the action, check on its status, cancel it, etc. And that's all described. Yeah, the link to the docs is down there. So if you are feeling a little more ambitious, you could